Why did you make the suggestion to Jamie to go inside the school today?
I was planning to murder him.
He asked his friend to follow him. Minutes later, he was dead. Before we get into this case, subscribe if you want more real, carefully researched true crime stories like this. Let's start. They were honor students, top of their class, until they started killing. Why did you make the suggestion to Jamie to go inside the school today? There's a pause. No panic. No hesitation. Oh, I was planning to murder him. That moment changes everything. Because we're taught to recognize danger. We're told monsters are obvious, loud, broken, angry. But what if that's wrong? What if the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody questions? The quiet one, the polite one, the perfect one, the student teachers praise, the friend parents trust. Michael Hernandez wasn't supposed to become a killer. He had good grades, a stable home, a future people believed in. Nothing about him raised alarms. Nothing about him suggested violence. But behind that image, something was building. Not chaos, not emotion, something controlled, something calculated, something patient. While other kids were studying for exams, Michael was studying something else entirely. Serial killers. Not casually, not out of curiosity. He studied them like a blueprint. How they planned, how they chose their victims, how they avoided getting caught. And slowly, something shifted. This wasn't fascination anymore. It was preparation. Because Michael didn't just want to understand killers. He wanted to become one. He started writing things down. Names, plans, ideas. Not random thoughts. Not imagination. A system, a process, a method. He believed he was different, smarter, more disciplined, more capable. And that belief turned into something far more dangerous. Purpose. Michael convinced himself he had a reason, a mission. Not revenge, not anger, something colder. He believed he was meant to kill, that it was necessary, that it made sense. And the most disturbing part? His targets weren't enemies. They weren't threats. They were people close to him, people who trusted him, friends. The ones who laughed with him, sat next to him, walked beside him through those same school hallways. They had no idea, no warning, no reason to be afraid, because the person they trusted was already planning how they would die. And that's what makes this case different. This wasn't a moment of rage. This wasn't a mistake. This was built, step by step, thought by thought, until there was only one thing left to do. And when that moment finally came, there would be no hesitation, no second thoughts, just execution. Because in his mind, he had already crossed the line. And the scariest part of all? He looked exactly like everyone else. The perfect student with a kill list on the surface. Michael Hernandez was everything people trusted. Top grades, good behavior, a normal life. If you asked anyone to point out the most likely student to succeed, his name would come up. Not once, but every time. Because nothing about him felt dangerous. Nothing about him suggested violence. But that's exactly what made him invisible. Because while everyone else saw a model student, Michael was quietly building something no one could see. A plan. Not something rushed. Not something emotional. Something structured. Something deliberate. Inside his backpack, there was a notebook. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Just pages filled with writing. But those pages weren't notes from class. They were something else entirely. Names, lists, targets, step-by-step thoughts on how to kill and get away with it. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't curiosity. This was rehearsal. Michael wasn't just reading about violence. He was studying it. The way a strategist studies a battlefield. The way an athlete studies opponents. Breaking everything down. Learning patterns. Understanding mistakes. Improving outcomes. He analyzed real killers. What they did right. Where they failed. How they got caught. And most importantly, how he could do it better. That's what makes this case so disturbing. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't impulse. It was calculated. Every thought, refined. Every idea, tested in his mind. Over and over again. Until it felt real. Until it felt possible. Until it felt inevitable. And then something shifted. Because at some point, planning stopped being enough. The line between thought and action started to disappear. Michael began to believe something dangerous. That he wasn't just capable of killing, but that he should. That he had a reason. A purpose. He convinced himself the world needed it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a loud, emotional way. But in a quiet, controlled, almost logical way. He told himself he was different. Smarter than everyone around him. More aware. More disciplined. And because of that, he believed the rules didn't apply to him. That normal people wouldn't understand. That what he was thinking, what he was planning, was justified. And that belief changed everything. Because once someone believes they're right, There's nothing left to stop them. No guilt. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just action. But the most disturbing part wasn't just the plan. It was the people on it. Because his targets weren't strangers. They weren't random. They were people he knew. People he spoke to every day. People who trusted him. Friends. The same people who sat next to him in class. Walked with him through the halls. Shared conversations. Shared laughter. They had no idea. No warning. No reason to question him. Because to them, Michael was safe. And that's what made them vulnerable. Because while they saw a friend, he saw something else. Something colder. Something detached. He didn't see people. He saw targets. And at the top of his list were the ones closest to him. Not because they did anything wrong. Not because they deserved it. But because in his mind, they were simply easier. Accessible. Trusting. Unaware. And then came the thought that pushed everything forward. The one that removed the last barrier. Michael started to believe that happiness itself was a flaw. That people who were happy didn't deserve to be. That they were weak. That they were blind. And in his mind, that made them perfect targets. Let that sink in. Not anger. Not revenge. Not desperation. Just a quiet, calculated decision. That certain people should die. And that he would be the one to do it. At that point, this wasn't a possibility anymore. It was a direction. A path he had already chosen. All that was left was the moment. The first step. The first act. Because once that happened, there would be no going back. The day everything changed, February 3rd, 2004. It didn't feel different. There were no warning signs in the air. No sense that something was about to go wrong. It was just another school day. Hallways filled with noise. Lockers slamming. Students laughing, moving from class to class. Normal. Completely normal. But for Michael Hernandez, this wasn't just another day. This was the day everything would finally become real. Because long before he stepped into that school, he had already made the decision. This wasn't a thought anymore. This wasn't a plan sitting quietly in a notebook. This was action. And he came prepared. Inside his backpack was everything he needed. A knife, gloves, a mask, duct tape. Not random items. Not things thrown together at the last minute. Each one had a purpose. Each one was part of something he had already played out in his mind. Over and over again. There was no hesitation left. No doubt. Because in his mind, he had already crossed the line. Now he just needed to follow through. And the most chilling part? He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He moved through the day like nothing was wrong. Walking through hallways. Sitting in class. Blending in. Just another student. That's what made him dangerous. Not chaos. Control. Michael knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew exactly how he wanted it to happen. So he made his first move. He approached one of his friends. Casual. Normal. The same way he always did. There was no tension in his voice. No sign that anything was off. Just a simple request. Follow me. Come with me to the bathroom. That was it. Nothing suspicious. Nothing alarming. Just enough to get someone alone. But this time, something didn't go as planned. His friend hesitated. Then refused. A small decision. A simple, no. But that one moment changed everything. Because without realizing it, he had just avoided becoming the first victim. And for a brief second, everything could have stopped there. The plan could have ended. The moment could have passed. But it didn't. Because Michael didn't stop. He didn't rethink. He didn't walk away. He adjusted. That's what makes this even more disturbing. He didn't need a specific person. He needed a target. So when one opportunity disappeared, he created another. And that's when he turned to someone else. Someone closer. Someone who trusted him even more. I am his best friend. The person who never would have said no. The person who had no reason to doubt him. And that's exactly why he chose him. Because trust made everything easier. There would be no hesitation. No suspicion. No resistance. Just compliance. So when Michael approached him, it felt normal. Just another conversation. Just another moment between friends. And when he asked him to follow him, Chaim didn't question it. Why would he? There was no reason to. That's the terrifying part. There was no warning. No signal that anything was wrong. Because the danger was standing right next to him. Smiling. Talking. Acting like nothing had changed. But everything had already changed. Because in Michael's mind, this moment had been decided long ago. Every step. Every movement. Every detail. And now, it was finally happening. They walked through the hallway together. Side by side. Just like they had done countless times before. Nothing looked different. Nothing felt different. But this time, it wasn't the same. Because only one of them knew how it was going to end. They reached the bathroom. An ordinary place. A place no one would think twice about. And that's exactly why it was chosen. Isolated. Quiet. Predictable. Michael stepped inside. And Chaim followed. No hesitation. No fear. Just trust. And the moment that door closed, everything changed. Because once they were inside, there was no one else around. No witnesses. No interruptions. No way to stop what was about to happen. This was it. The point of no return. The moment where planning becomes reality. Where thought becomes action. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Because in that small, confined space, Michael Hernandez was no longer just a student. He was something else entirely. And Chaim was about to realize it too late. Betrayal inside the stall the moment that door closed. Everything changed. Outside, the school continued like nothing was wrong. Students laughed. Teachers taught. Time moved forward. But inside that bathroom, time slowed down. Because in that small, confined space, there was no noise from the outside world. No distractions. No interruptions. Just two people. One who trusted completely. And one who had already decided how this would end. At first, nothing felt different. No raised voices. No argument. No sign that anything was about to happen. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels normal. Until it isn't. Chaim had no reason to be afraid. Why would he? The person standing in front of him wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone dangerous. It was his friend. Someone he had laughed with, talked to, spent time with, someone he trusted. And that's what made this moment so devastating. Because the danger didn't come from outside. It didn't come with a warning. It came from someone he never expected. And when it happened, it was sudden. No build-up. No hesitation. Just instant violence. The kind that doesn't give you time to understand what's happening. 1 second everything is normal. And the next, it isn't. Confusion. Disbelief. Because your mind tries to make sense of it. Tries to process how something like this could be real. But there's no time. No space to react. No way to prepare. Because the person you trusted has already crossed the line. And in that moment, Chaim realized something no one should ever have to realize. The person in front of him wasn't his friend anymore. What followed wasn't chaos. It wasn't uncontrolled. It was relentless. Repeated. Deliberate. Over and over again. In a place with nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. The walls closing in. The space shrinking. Every second stretching longer than it should. And the most disturbing part wasn't just the violence. It was the intent behind it. Because this wasn't emotion. This wasn't anger. This was execution. Every movement had already existed in Michael's mind. Every step had already been imagined. Rehearsed. Refined. Until this moment felt like something he had done before. Even though he hadn't. That's what made it so controlled. So precise. So final. And when it was over, there was no panic. No sudden realization of what had just happened. No breaking point. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that feels wrong. Because something irreversible had just taken place. And yet nothing in his expression changed. No fear. No regret. No emotion. Just silence. Michael stepped back. Looked at what he had done. And didn't react. Not the way anyone would expect. Not the way anyone would understand. Because in his mind, this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something to regret. This was something he had planned. Something he had completed. And that changed everything. Because once someone crosses that line and feels nothing, there's nothing left to stop them. But what happened next was even more unsettling. Because instead of running, instead of panicking, Michael stayed. Composed. Controlled. He walked to the sink, turned on the water, and began to clean himself. Slowly. Carefully. Like this was just another routine. Another normal moment in his day. The sound of running water filled the room, washing away what had just happened. Or at least, trying to. He looked at his reflection. Not shocked. Not disturbed. Just neutral. Adjusting his appearance. Making sure everything looked normal. Because that's what mattered now. Not what he had done. But how he appeared. Because as long as he looked normal, no one would question him. And that's exactly what he relied on. That illusion. That mask. The same one he had been wearing all along. Once he was done, he turned off the water. The room fell silent again. And then, he walked out. Back into the hallway. Back into the noise. Back into the normal world. Where nothing had changed. Except everything had. Students passed by him. Talking. Laughing. Unaware. Completely unaware. That just moments ago, something unthinkable had happened. Just a few feet away. And the person responsible was walking right past them. Blending in. Just another student. That's what makes this moment so disturbing. Not just what happened inside that bathroom, but what happened after. Because Michael didn't look like someone who had just committed a crime. He looked exactly the same. Quiet. Normal. And that's what allowed him to walk right back into his day. As if nothing had happened. But the truth was, everything had already changed. And the consequences were about to catch up. Sitting in class after murder minutes later, he was back in class. Sitting in his seat. Pen in hand. Head down. Taking a test. Like nothing had happened. No rushing. No panic. No sign that anything was wrong. Just another student, finishing his work. That's what made this moment so unsettling. Because everything about it looked normal. The quiet scratching of pens on paper. The teacher walking between desks. Students focused on their exams. A routine scene. Calm. Predictable. Ordinary. And right in the middle of it, sat someone who had just crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. But if you looked at him, you wouldn't know. There was no visible fear. No shaking hands. No frantic behavior. Just stillness. Control. Precision. As if nothing had changed. As if the last few minutes never happened. That's what made him different. Because most people would break. They would panic. They would rush out. They would make mistakes. But Michael didn't. He stayed. He blended in. He became invisible again. And for a moment, it worked. But not perfectly. Because no matter how controlled someone is, there are always small details. Tiny cracks. Things you can't completely hide. And in this case, it was something simple. Something small. Something easy to overlook. Until you don't. Blood. Not obvious at first. Not dramatic. Just enough to be noticed. A stain. Faint, but there. And it didn't go unnoticed. The teacher saw it. A quick glance. A moment of confusion. Because it didn't make sense. Why would a student sitting quietly during a test have blood on him? So she asked. Calmly. Casually. Not expecting anything serious. Just a simple question. What happened? And this is where everything could have fallen apart. This is where panic could have exposed everything. This is where the truth could have slipped out. But it didn't. Because Michael was ready. Not just for the act, but for what came after. He didn't hesitate. Didn't stutter. Didn't over-explain. Just one word. Simple. Believable. Controlled. Nosebleed. That was it. No elaboration. No extra detail. Just enough to answer the question. And nothing more. And for a moment, it worked. Because it made sense. People get nosebleeds. It happens. It's normal. And that's what made the lie effective. It fit into the world around it. It didn't stand out. It didn't raise immediate alarm. So the moment passed. The teacher moved on. The class continued. Pens kept moving. Time kept going. And once again, Michael disappeared into the normalcy of the room. But something had already shifted. Because outside that classroom, the truth was waiting to be discovered. And it didn't take long. Down the hallway, someone walked into that same bathroom. The same place that had been empty just minutes before. The same place that now held something no one was prepared to see. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Just another quiet school bathroom. But then, something felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. And then it was seen. A moment that instantly shattered everything. So, confusion. Then realization. And once that realization hit, there was no containing it. Because what had happened couldn't stay hidden. Not anymore. Within seconds, the atmosphere changed. What was calm became chaos. What was normal became panic. Voices raised. Footsteps rushing. Doors opening. People trying to understand what they were seeing. And failing. Because nothing prepares you for a moment like that. Nothing makes it make sense. And as the reality spread through the building, everything began to unravel. Teachers reacting. Students being pulled from classrooms. Whispers turning into fear. Fear turning into alarm. And then, sirens. Loud. Unavoidable. Breaking through the normalcy. Replacing it with something else entirely. Emergency vehicles arriving. Authorities stepping in. Questions being asked. And slowly, the focus began to shift. From what happened, to who did it. Because in a place filled with hundreds of students, someone was responsible. Someone had walked those same hallways. Sat in those same classrooms. Blended in. And they were still there. Unidentified. Unnoticed. Hiding in plain sight. And the truth? He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was sitting right there. Still in class. Still taking his test. Still acting like nothing had happened. But that wouldn't last. Because the moment the discovery was made, everything changed. The timeline started closing in. The questions started getting sharper. The details started connecting. And it was only a matter of time before everything pointed back to him. The interrogation, by the time the police arrived, the illusion was already falling apart. What had started as confusion was turning into clarity, slowly, piece by piece. Because scenes like this leave traces, details, evidence. And the more they looked, the more everything began to point in one direction. The bathroom, the timeline, the students who had been nearby. And then, Michael. At first he wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't even trying to leave. He was still there. In the same building. In the same environment. Surrounded by the same people. As if nothing had happened. But that normalcy didn't last. Because once investigators started asking questions, small details began to surface. Who was seen where? Who left class? Who came back? Moments that didn't seem important at first, suddenly mattered. And Michael's name kept coming up. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to take a closer look. Enough to raise a question. And once that question was asked, everything moved quickly. He was pulled aside, separated from the rest. No accusations at first, just questions. Controlled. Routine. But this wasn't routine, because while investigators were asking questions, they were also watching, studying, waiting for something. A reaction, a mistake, anything that didn't fit. But Michael didn't give them that. He didn't panic, didn't become defensive, didn't try to explain too much. He stayed exactly the same. Quiet, still, controlled. That alone was enough to stand out. Because in a situation like this, people react. They show fear, confusion. But Michael didn't. And that absence of emotion started to become its own kind of signal. So they went further. They searched his belongings. His backpack. The same one he had been carrying all day. The same one that had moved through the halls unnoticed. The same one that looked completely ordinary. Until it wasn't. Because inside was everything. The knife, the gloves, the mask, the duct tape, all of it, still there. Still hidden. But no longer invisible. And just like that, the situation changed. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't a possibility. This was confirmation. Something had happened. And now, they knew who was responsible. But what happened next was what truly shocked them. Because when confronted with evidence like that, there's usually a reaction. Denial, panic, fear, something, anything. But not this. Michael didn't break. He didn't argue. He didn't try to escape the situation. He just sat there, looking at them, as if this was expected. As if this moment had already played out in his mind, just like everything else. And maybe it had. Because when they brought him into the interrogation room, nothing changed. Same posture, same expression, same stillness. A room designed to create pressure, to make people uncomfortable, to push them into talking. But it didn't work. Not the way it usually does. Because Michael wasn't reacting to the environment. He wasn't reacting to the situation. He was just there, listening, answering. But only when necessary. And even then, barely. Short responses. Minimal words. No emotion attached. It was like trying to read something that wasn't there. So they asked the obvious questions. What happened? Why did you do it? What were you thinking? Questions that usually bring out something. Guilt, fear, regret. But again, nothing. No visible change. No emotional shift. Just the same flat tone. The same detached presence. And then came the moment that defined everything. Why did you make the suggestion to Jamie to go inside the school today? Pause. Not long. Just enough. I was planning to murder him. No hesitation. No weight behind the words. Just a statement. Simple. Direct. Final. And in that moment, everything became clear. Because that wasn't someone struggling to explain their actions. That wasn't someone overwhelmed by what they had done. That was someone stating a fact. Like it meant nothing. Like it required no emotion. And that's what made it so disturbing. Because it wasn't just the confession. It was how easily it came out. No resistance. No conflict. Just acceptance. As if this was always the outcome. As if this was always the plan. But it didn't stop there. Because when they asked him how he felt, about everything that had just happened, about the life that had been taken, about the consequences that were now unavoidable, his answer was just as empty. I don't know. That was it. Not confusion. Not denial. Just nothing. And in that moment, investigators realized something critical. This wasn't about impulse. This wasn't about losing control. This was something else entirely. Something colder. Something more calculated. Because the absence of emotion said more than any reaction ever could. And as the interrogation continued, one thing became clear. Michael wasn't concerned about what he had done. He wasn't thinking about the victim. He wasn't thinking about the impact. The only thing that seemed to matter was whether or not he would get caught. And now, that question had already been answered. He wasn't done for most people. There's a moment after something irreversible happens. A moment where reality sets in. Where the weight of what they've done finally hits. Fear, regret, panic, something, anything. But that moment never came. Not for Michael. Because in the hours, days, and even years that followed, there was no visible shift. No emotional collapse. No breaking point. Just the same stillness. The same detachment. And that's what made this case even more disturbing. Because what happens after the act usually tells you everything you need to know. And in this case, it revealed something deeply unsettling. Michael wasn't overwhelmed by what had happened. He wasn't struggling to process it. He wasn't trying to make sense of it. Because to him, it already made sense. That's why there was no reaction. No visible change. Because in his mind, this wasn't chaos. This wasn't a mistake. This was something he had planned. Something he had completed. And once it was done, there was nothing left to feel. But there was something else. Something subtle, but far more disturbing. Curiosity. Not about the consequences. Not about the impact. But about the act itself. He wasn't focused on what he had taken. He was focused on what he had experienced. What it looked like. What it felt like. What happened during those moments. Details. Observations. Things most people would never even think to notice. In a situation like that. Because for most people, those details would be overshadowed by shock. By guilt. By fear. But for Michael, they stood out. And that difference is what separates this case from so many others. Because it wasn't just the absence of emotion. It was the presence of something else. Something colder. Something analytical. As time passed, that didn't change. If anything, it became clearer. Because even after everything, the investigation, the trial, the sentencing, the reality of what his life had become, there was still no shift, no moment of reflection, no sign of regret. And that's what made the next part so difficult to understand. Because even from behind prison walls, the same patterns remained. Phone calls, conversations, moments where he spoke about everything that had happened. And again, there was nothing. No remorse. No emotional weight. Just the same detached tone. The same flat delivery. As if he was describing something ordinary. Something distant. Something that didn't carry meaning. And in those moments, it became clear. This wasn't something that faded with time. This wasn't something that changed under pressure. This was consistent, stable, unmoving. Because the person who had made that decision was still there. The mindset hadn't disappeared. It hadn't weakened. It hadn't been replaced. And that's what made it so unsettling. Because when someone shows no emotional response immediately after an act like that, you might think time will change it. That reflection will bring something out. That reality will eventually settle in. But in this case, it didn't. Years passed. But the silence remained. The detachment remained. The lack of remorse remained. And that raises a question that's difficult to answer. Not just about what happened, but about who he was. Because if there's no regret, no emotional response, no shift over time, then what does that say? What does that mean? And more importantly, what does that tell us about the difference between appearance and reality? Because from the outside, everything about Michael had once seemed normal, predictable, safe. But underneath that, something else had always been there. Something that didn't react the way people expect. Something that didn't follow the same emotional rules. And once it was revealed, it never went away. That's what makes this chapter so important. Not just because of what happened, but because of what didn't. No remorse. No guilt. No visible change. Just a continuation of the same mindset that existed long before that day. And the most unsettling part? If you didn't know the story, if you didn't know what had happened, you wouldn't be able to tell. Because on the surface, nothing gave it away. And that's what makes it so difficult to understand. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what you can see. It's what you can't. The survivor returns years past. Time moved forward. But what happened that day never really left. Not for the school. Not for the people who were there. And especially not for the ones who came closest to becoming part of it. Because while one life was taken, another was almost lost. And that story didn't end in that bathroom. It continued, quietly, over time, until one day, it came full circle. Andre Martin, the boy who said no, the one who was asked to follow, and chose not to. A small decision, a simple moment, but one that changed everything. Because if he had said yes, this story would have ended very differently. But he didn't, and because of that, he got something no one else in this case did. Time. Time to grow. Time to understand. Time to move forward. But moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. Because some moments stay with you. They don't fade. They don't disappear. They become part of you. And for Andre, that moment became something else. Not fear. Not anger. Something stronger. Purpose. Because instead of being defined by what almost happened, he chose to define what came next. Years later, he walked into a courtroom. Not as a victim. Not as someone looking for answers. But as someone who had taken a completely different path. A path that put him face to face with the past. But this time, on his own terms. He was no longer the kid in the hallway. No longer the one being asked to follow. He was standing there. As a police officer. Wearing the uniform. Representing something bigger than himself. And that moment carried weight. Because across that room was the person who had once planned to take his life. The same person. The same face. But a completely different reality. One moved forward. The other stayed exactly where everything fell apart. And for a moment, everything collided. Past and present. What almost happened, and what actually did. Two paths that started in the same place. but ended in completely different directions. And in that courtroom, there was no chaos, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, just silence. The kind of silence that carries meaning, because not every moment needs words. Some moments speak for themselves, and this was one of them, because standing there, Andre didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to explain what that day meant, or how close everything came to changing. It was already understood, in the way he stood, in what he had become, in the fact that he was there at all. And that contrast said everything, because while one person had been consumed by a decision made years ago, the other had built something beyond it, something stronger, something that couldn't be taken away. And that's what makes this moment so powerful, not just because of who was in the room, but because of what it represents. Just the idea that even in the same moment, under the same circumstances, two people can take completely different paths, one driven by control, the other by purpose, one ending in destruction, the other in something greater. And when those two paths finally crossed again, there was no need for confrontation, because the outcome was already clear. One life stopped moving forward, the other never did. And sometimes, that's the strongest form of justice there is. The truth no one wants to see by the end of this story. Most people are left searching for something, an explanation, a warning sign, a moment where everything could have been stopped, because that's what we naturally look for. We want to believe that cases like this leave clues behind, something obvious, something noticeable, something that tells us this could have been prevented. But the truth is, that's not always how it works, because in this case, there was no single moment that stood out, no clear breaking point, no obvious shift from normal to dangerous, just a series of small moments that didn't seem important at the time. And that's what makes this story so difficult to process, because if there were no clear signs, then what does that mean? It means the version of people we see isn't always the full picture. It means someone can appear completely normal while thinking something entirely different. And that's uncomfortable, because it challenges something we rely on every day, our ability to read people, to trust what we see, to believe that we can recognize danger before it happens. But sometimes, you can't. Sometimes, there's nothing to recognize, no warning, no signal, no visible change. And that realization is what stays with you long after the story ends. Because this wasn't just about one decision. It wasn't just about one moment. It was about a mindset that existed long before anyone noticed. A mindset that didn't develop overnight. A mindset that didn't need chaos to reveal itself. It was already there, quiet, unseen. And when the moment came, it didn't hesitate. It didn't question. It acted. And once it did, everything changed. A life was taken. Families were left with questions that will never be fully answered. A community was forced to confront something they never expected. And two paths that started in the same place ended in completely different ways. One defined by a single irreversible choice. The other defined by the decision not to follow. And that contrast is what this entire story comes down to. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about what happened. It's about how close things came to being even worse. How one decision can separate two completely different outcomes. And how sometimes, the difference between them comes down to a single moment. A single choice. A single no. But even with that, there's still something that doesn't sit right. Because when there's no visible warning, no clear signs, no way to predict what's coming, it forces you to ask a question most people don't want to think about. How well do we really know the people around us? Not the version they show, not the version everyone sees, but who they are, when no one is watching. Because that's where the real answers are. And in this case, those answers didn't come until it was too late. That's why this story stays with people. Not because of how it started, not even because of how it ended, but because of what it reveals in between. The idea that sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one you would never suspect. The one who looks the part, acts the part, fits in perfectly, until they don't. And by the time that changes, it's already too late. So the next time you hear a story like this, it won't feel as distant. It won't feel like something that could never happen. Because now you understand something most people overlook. Danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look different. Sometimes, it looks exactly like everyone else. And that's the part no one wants to see. If you're here for thoughtful, well-researched true crime, subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.